Welcome to Chapter 3, Culture. The important objectives for us to learn when it comes to culture is, well, what exactly is culture, how we use language, the norms and values of society, global culture war, sociological perspectives on culture, cultural variation, development of culture around the world, and social policy and culture dealing with bilingualism. So, what is culture? So, culture is a totality of learned, socially transmitted customs, knowledge, material objects, and behavior. Culture is basically what makes you you. It's what you partake in. It's anything that brings you together with another group of people. So, your culture could be part of your race, your culture could be part of your religion, your culture could be some of your hobbies. If you like riding horses, if you like racing cars, if you love hip hop music, all of that are various parts of culture. And then, of course, there's American culture. So we have a culture and then we have co-cultures, and you could probably be part of 1,000 cultures. Common culture is what you share with other people in society. It is what links you together with them. It's what groups you together with them. So you can think about our simple day-to-day interactions. If you're somebody that has to always go to Starbucks or you always need your coffee, then you could be part of a coffee culture. Culture also influences human behavior. So I'm from California, so in the Californian culture, we don't really say hi to people on the street that we don't know. It's deemed odd. So whenever I visit back home and I smile and wave, because I've lived in Texas and in the Midwest out here in Kentucky and in Indiana, people look at me oddly. So getting the Midwestern / Southern hospitality culture is something that I have now grown accustomed to. And then there's culture industry. So worldwide media industry that standardizes goods and services demanded by consumers. So if you think of iPhones, hip hop music, the way that we dress, Western culture is very, very dominant in all these other countries, and we are dominating also in Western culture. So what we like, other people like. If you think of Hollywood, a lot of people, no matter where they live, they have heard of Hollywood. They even have their own versions of Hollywood. They have Bollywood, Nollywood. It just depends on the country they're from, but it's all based off of Hollywood in the U.S. Cultural universals are common practices and beliefs that all societies have developed. So, this anthropologist called George Murdoch, he had a list of cultural universals, but they can be expressed differently. So, if you think of weddings or funerals, depending which culture somebody is from, they might do their funeral differently. So, we know the way that we usually do it here. People wear black. You might have a wake, you have a viewing, you have the funeral. But in some cultures, you can only wear white. Some cultures, they actually cut off their fingers if they lose a family member. Some cultures, they practice endocannibalism. And yes, that's where they eat the dead family member. And then some cultures, they bury them, they call them sky burials. So they bury them way up on the mountains. So it just depends on the culture. But some of these other things that George Murdoch dealt with was sports, cooking, dancing, visiting, names, marriage, medicine, rituals as far as religion goes, sexual restrictions, and trade. Ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is a tendency to assume that one's own culture and way of life is superior to others. So basically, whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever you are, you believe your stuff is the best and everyone else's is different. It's odd, and they should conform to how you believe or how you live. Cultural relativism is basically viewing people's behaviors from the perspective of their own culture. So depending where you're from, you view everything from that lens. So we all have our own perspective, and perception is reality. So whatever your perspective or your perception is of your culture, that's how we view other cultures. So for instance, when it comes to child marriage, in the U.S., the majority of people in the U.S. are against child marriage, but in some cultures or countries, it is okay to marry someone off at the age of 9 or 11. And so usually for people in the U.S., we would deem that terrible, among other words you might want to use. So here is a map where it shows you some countries that have high rates of child marriage. The ones that have more than 60% are this darker reddish / brown, maybe a rust color. And then we move into the orange, and they have 41 to 60% of child marriage that is allowed. The countries that where it's like white or this weird pale grayish, that's where we don't have any data that's available. I do think they should study the U.S. because some people do marry children in the U.S. and in certain states it's frowned upon, but some people have gotten away with it, especially if the parents are complicit in it. So say, for instance, if a young girl in the U.S. Had sex with somebody who's older and maybe gotten pregnant. So you've heard of shotgun weddings. Well, that's basically the idea, is forcing your child to marry this person. So sadly, that does still happen in the U.S., but it's more predominant in some of these other cultures that have the darker colors. Sociobiology and culture. So it's how biology affects human behavior. So Darwin's theory of evolution basically deals with passing on the dominant genes, the positive genes, the healthier genes onto our offspring. And so our offspring is healthier and they live longer. Of course, medication and technology has interrupted that, I would say, when it comes to evolution. But when it comes to social biologists using Darwin's theory, they think of it with natural selection. So they assume that particular forms of behavior become genetically linked to a species if they contribute to fitness to survive. So for people that don't eat meat, their genes are stronger in some ways than people that do eat meat. So those positive genes will be passed on. Role of language. So we use language to communicate, and it's very important as far as humans go. It's an important component of cultural capital. And if you think of capital as like a benefit, so if you speak your language very well, then you can talk to a variety of people, you can accomplish things, you can get things done. If you speak multiple languages, then you're able to have cultural capital also with that other culture that speaks that certain language. It deals with day-to-day exchanges and includes both the written and spoken and nonverbal communication. So as far as sign language goes, if you think of that, American Sign Language, so we have our American Sign Language, but if you think of other countries, they have their own form of sign language. So it could be Bosnian Sign Language, it could be Mexican Sign Language, and usually with sign language, they rely heavily on nonverbal communication, which we all should rely on nonverbal communication, but it helps people enunciate it when they don't have the vocal abilities. Language written and spoken. So it's an abstract system of word meanings and symbols for all aspects of culture. And right now there are about 7,000 languages that are spoken. However, there are other languages that we don't know about because they haven't been colonized or westernized. That's just how the people want it there. So we don't really know if there's more languages than that. There are a lot of groups of people that haven't been infiltrated. And then there are other cultures or variations of people that don't have a written language. Everything is spoken and it's passed down in their culture. So moving on to the Schaefer-Wolf hypothesis. So those were two different sociologists, and basically they dealt with language and how language precedes thought. So for them, they believe that we can't articulate anything, we can't understand things, we can't think things unless we actually have the words for it. So language is not a given, though. It's something that we have to learn in order to express ourselves and articulate ourselves. However, with sociologists and linguists and psychology and things like that, it's not always black and white. So in my opinion, that's just our hypothesis. But in my opinion, I do believe babies come out with a language of their own, if that makes sense. They make certain sounds when they're hungry. They know how to root to get their mother's breast in order to eat. They make certain sounds when they're tired. So the cries are actually a little distinctive. Nonverbal communication is very important. It's gestures, facial expressions, and other images we use to communicate. And we have different symbols that we use for different words or to mean certain things, like thumbs up here could mean a good thing. In some other countries, it could actually mean the same thing as the middle finger. But when it comes to nonverbal communication, it's very important to pay attention to that. I think it's something that should actually be taught. So you can tell if somebody means what they're saying in a situation or if they mean the opposite. So if you ask me how I'm doing and I'm like, I'm great, and I smile, or I could say I'm great, but kind of look down, have my voice kind of lower, which is also part of nonverbal communication, even though I'm using my voice, but the different intonations that I could use is part of nonverbal communication, so I could actually tell you more about what's going on. Norms and values. So all societies have ways to encourage and enforce appropriate behavior and discourage inappropriate behavior. So we have an idea of what's right and what's wrong. Like we know it's not okay to run up to somebody and just push them down, or we know it's not okay to rob a bank because there are punishments for those behaviors. In some countries and people still, they actually chop off their hand, so less people steal in those countries for obvious reasons. Norms. Standards of behavior maintained by society. Norms continue. So there are various types of norms. We have formal norms where they are the laws. We have informal norms where it's understood that you shouldn't do it. Sort of like spitting. In some states, it's illegal to spit. I mean, technically, you can get a ticket for it. In other states, it's not. But for most of us, we know like it's not okay to like just spit in front of people, like during a conversation. That would be the informal norm. Mores are norms that are deemed highly necessary to the welfare of society. So that could be like we have these safety nets as far as dealing with food insecurity for children. So we want children to have access to food. So we'll have, food in the schools for them for breakfast, also for lunch if they don't get the food at home. And then we have folkways, so norms governing everyday behavior. So we say please and thank you, we smile at people, we say hello. Norms and sanctions. So sanctions can be good or bad. Usually we think of sanction as a bad thing. You might hear it when it comes to politicians. And that would be a fine, a threat, imprisonment, or staring at somebody with contempt. Like they say something, you just look at them like, really? Or if your kid is, being disobedient, you might give them the look, the mom look, and then they just stop whatever they're doing. Positive sanctions would be a medal, words of gratitude or affirmation, a pat on the back, or a pay raise. This slide just breaks down formal norms with positive sanctions and negative sanctions, and informal norms with positive sanctions and negative sanctions. Acceptance of norms. So people don't always accept the norms. The norm would be whatever is normal for you in your culture and in your society. What is ever normal for you in your everyday environment or your neighborhood. So anyone that goes against the norms would be like an outcast or an outlaw. You can think of the black sheep, and it might cause conflict when someone is going against the norm. Values in response to cultural values. So it's the collective conceptions of what is good, desirable, and proper, or bad, undesirable, and improper. So you think of morals, values, basically your thoughts and interactions with other people, the influence that your family, friends has had on you, that your education has had on you. Values, so they can differ depending on their culture. So one example from the book is public opinion in various cultures regarding premarital cohabitation. So I have some students from Iraq, and when we talk about abortion and having children outside of being married, for them that's just such a slim chance from where they're from. Compared to the US here, there are plenty of people that cohabitate without being married. And it just depends on the culture and what is normal for that country. As mentioned before, some countries are more accepting of non-marital cohabitation while others are against it. So this is just a display of that. Global culture war. So culture war is when society is polarized. So right now the US is polarized when it comes to the gun control, sexual orientation, abortion, healthcare, taxes. There's like a lot of things that polarize people. And polarized means that people are completely on different sides of the spectrum when it comes to these issues. So those are usually the hot topic, hot button issues. Sociological perspectives on cultures. So functionalists maintain that social stability requires a consensus and the support of society's members, and that the strong central values and common norms provide that support. So basically, they want society to function at the highest rate that it can, and they go off basic norms. So consensus would be what most people agree is the norm. And then conflict theorists argue that the common culture serves to maintain the privileges of certain groups. So it would cause conflicts for those that are part of subgroups or minority groups. Sociological perspectives on culture continued. So we have dominant ideology, and that is basically the ideals or the cultures or beliefs or practices that are dominant or mainstream in society. So if you think of Christian culture, that is dominant in the U.S. society. When it comes to economic interests, what's dominant is a capitalist society, and that means that people, like supply and demand, and people are able to make as much money as possible. And then we have political interests. So as far as the right to own guns, the right to not own guns, or people putting restrictions on certain type of guns. So there's some conflict when it comes to that. So I believe most people in the U.S. believe it's okay for everyone to own guns. However, there should be some stipulations on certain types of guns. So that would be dealing with the conflict. Cultural variation. So cultures adapt to meet specific circumstances, so it just depends on where you live. If you move some other place, you might have to adapt to like the level of technology. So some places have Google Fiber where the internet is extremely fast, and other places haven't gotten to that point yet in the US. Also the population, some places have lots of people, some places don't. As far as geography goes, some places are flat, some places are dusty, and then some places have lots of hills and trees. So depending on where you live, you're going to have to eventually adjust to the culture that is there. Subcultures. So we have the American culture, and then we have cultures that are smaller but that are part of the American culture. So some people, they're American, but they also identify as black. Some people identify as Moors. Some people identify as Muslims. We would identify as Christians. Some people are Jews. Some people have the culture of loving horses. Some people, for them, it's a very extremely big deal to go to Derby and participate in all the activities. So we have various subcultures within our American large culture. So a subculture may develop in argot, which is a specialized language that distinguishes a subculture from the wider society. So if you think of people that have their own language, people that live in Appalachia, they have their own language. And there's other various groups of people that have their own. Countercultures. So counterculture is a subculture that is basically against the larger culture. So they usually thrive among the young people. So for an example, they have from the book would be counterterrorism experts in the U.S. concerned about growth of ultra-conservative militia groups. So militia groups are against the government. They believe in laissez-faire, so they want the government to have their hands off of anything that they deal with. So that is an example of a counterculture. So basically it's anybody that goes against the grain, that goes against the norm of our society. Culture shock. So if you've ever going to some place that's completely different than what you're used to, you will experience culture shock, and you'll feel disoriented, uncertain, and some people feel fearful because things are unfamiliar. So if you've ever moved to a different region in the U.S., if you ever moved to a different country, you'll experience these things. Sometimes even cities, it could be a culture shock if you're from the country and then you move to a large city that's really, really busy. So you'll experience a culture shock. Everything's just very different, and it's something that you're going to have to adjust to over time. So this table basically breaks down some sociological perspectives on culture. We have functionalists, conflict, feminists, and interactionists. So functionalists deals with the norms of society, and they want things to function in the most productive way possible. And then conflict deals with patterns of dominance. So who's the dominant culture, who is not part of the dominant culture, and that causes conflict. And feminist deals with the roles of men and women, what their values are, and then what's deemed as normal for a male and a female. And then interactionist perspective on sociology deals with the face-to-face interaction between people. So what affects our daily lives, how people interact. Development of culture around the world. So every country and every culture, every religion, every race of people have their own culture or cultures that they subscribe to or that they're part of. But we do transfer cultures across the world. So like I mentioned before, Western culture is very dominant. So when it comes to using iPhones, we spread that around. McDonald's is in various different countries. So they call it the McDonaldization of the world. Walmarts are being placed in various places. And as far as things being brought to the U.S., if you think of K-pop music, if you're into that Korean pop culture, that has recently been brought to the U.S., and there's that group called BTS. So they're pretty popular, and I believe they've performed at some awards here. So that would be their innovation being brought to us. Globalization, diffusion, and technology. So as I mentioned in the last slide, the McDonaldization of society. So is basically how the fast food industry is everywhere, and then also how McDonald's is in a lot of countries. This is in the majority of countries around the world. Of course, they changed the menu to fit into the region that they're in. And then technology. So cultural information is used for material resources and for the environment to satisfy human needs and desires. So if you think of the internet being spread everywhere, so the majority of the world doesn't have access to the internet, but it is currently growing and being globalized. Sociologist Ogburn made distinctions between material culture and non-material culture, which could lead to cultural lag. So if you think of non-material culture, it would be the beliefs that people have when it comes to coal mining. That's what they're used to. Maybe their parents did, their grandparents did it. That's how they make their money. That's all they know, right? You can think of a lot of people that live in Appalachia. And then the material culture would be the technological advancement. So right now we know it is important to use clean energy, and that's probably the best for the future of the world. So for people that are coal miners, for them, they're experiencing cultural lag, and it's where they feel uncomfortable and experience maladjustment, because it's like, well, if that's all you know, then how do you do something else? And with the fact that education costs so much money, and then some people in Appalachia don't have access to education, even for K through 12, they don't have proper access to education, and they don't have access to colleges unless they were to leave. They also don't have access to money, so for them, it's harder to understand that the world is going to change with or without them. I do wish we could have programs well, I wish education was free. That's just my personal thoughts, not saying that you have to buy into that. But I wish that for people that believe in the coal mining and things like that, since we know it's also harmful to their health and harmful to the earth, I wish we could train them in other avenues that would also be productive and make them money where they currently live. So I think that would help with the cultural lag when it comes to that. Social policy and culture, dealing with bilingualism. So it's where you use two or more languages in a particular setting. With education, people will speak their native language and then speak the host language of the country. So for us, the host language right now is English. It is dominant. However, it wasn't the initial official language. So bilingualism can be important. It does use multiple parts of the brain. So children that are bilingual use more of their brain than children that are not bilingual. It also helps you deal with various types of situations. So in the workforce as a nurse, it could help you because you could help certain patients that don't speak the dominant language, or you could actually be a translator and get paid for that. My sister-in-law, one of them, she's Dominican, and so she's an RN, so she works at a hospital. She also works at a care home as needed PRN. But she also now lends out her services to come to hospitals to help in certain situations if the person only speaks Spanish. So she can help in that situation. So here is a map of the U.S. and it shows that people speak other languages than English at home. So the ones with brown, there's a larger percentage of people that speak other languages, and as you see, I'm from one of those states. Then it moves down to those in the green. And so in Kentucky, it's 2.3 to 6.4% of people speak a different language. So in Kentucky, people are less likely to want their children to be forced to speak a different language in school, because it's just less predominant here than other places. However, it can be a benefit to you if you learn another language. Now, it's very hard to be completely fluent, but if you can get the basics down, or you know some terms of another language as far as healthcare goes, that can be very beneficial to you, especially if you plan on moving or if you're going to be a traveling nurse.